That is seriously insane. And it was fermenting at 101 degrees. The beer was almost completely finished in 18 hours. It dropped from 17 degrees Plato to 4 in 18 hours. What kind of impact might this make, for a brewery or the industry? Being able to turn a double IPA literally in 4 days, so from grain to glass in 4 days versus 12 or 14, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to sort of figure that out.
We're at Old Devil Moon for the Kveiking Raid 2, the Kveikening. This is our second event focused on Kveik fermented beers, and I think it is safe to say this is the most Kveik fermented ales and ciders ever offered under one roof outside of Norway, and it will remain that way for a few more months until there's an upcoming festival in Chicago that I've heard about. I've got a couple folks here with me. I'm Chris Cohen. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm a partner here at Old Devil Moon and Advanced Cicerone, and just a sort of proponent of Kveik, and I'm just interested in it, so I've been learning a lot about it. Went to Norway, met some farmhouse brewers there, went to the Norsk Cornel Festival late last year. We're going to talk a lot about it, but it's very exciting. I think it will bring some changes to the craft beer industry, so I think it's important. And I've got two guys here who know some things about it. We got Damian Fagan
from Off Color Brewing.
Yeah, the co-founder of Almanac Beer Company. Him and his brewers have been experimenting with Kveik for making some ales. What have you done, like 5 now? And I think we're gonna have to pass. We only have 2 mics, so we're gonna have to pass that one back and forth a little more.
Dude, I want both mics.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did, Hot as Hell is our 5th Kveik beer.
Okay, yeah. So we did this little collab here, Hot as Hell, HEL, which is the name of the being and the realm where most people in Norse mythology went when they died. And then we also have Lance Shaner, who is the co-founder of Omega Yeast Lab in Chicago, flew in for this event. And I would say he's probably one of the world's experts on Kveik, I think it's fair to say. I don't know if he'll accept that, but he sells through Omega Labs 3 of the most popular strains for brewing. I think we all have very different experiences with it, and we all have plenty to talk about, and then we'll do a little Q&A. This is supposed to be very, very easy, very chill. I didn't ask everyone to prepare talks or anything, so maybe I'll just talk for 5 minutes, and then we'll just pass the mic around. We can each talk about our experiences with it and then take questions, and also I can ask you guys questions.
Sounds fair.
Kveik is, so the first thing to say about it is, and I think it's fair to say everyone who sees it written is confused about how to say it. Yeah, so there's 3 ways I've heard Norwegian people say it when I was there. Kveik, I think with the subtle V sound, is the most kind of correct from what I understand, and then Kveik is an easier way to say it that is mostly correct, and then Kveik, I heard especially some northern Norwegians, maybe you can, yeah, from Trondheim, yeah, and they do throw a little V sound in there, but it's complicated for English speakers. Kveik, Kveik, if you say it any of those ways, I think you're mostly correct.
Key to making a good pun with it.
Yeah, I don't call anything out, but there was a beer called Kveik the Freak that I got my hands on once, and that was obviously they thought that it was pronounced Kveik, right? Because they were trying to do a little rhyme scheme, but that's not how you say it. So anyway, Kveik is a landrace yeast, which means that it's like a traditional brewer's yeast that has had evolutionary pressure on it for many, many generations going back. I don't think anyone really knows exactly how far, but 1,000 years, something like that.
I think the brewing strains, they date back to the 1600s, something like that, and it's got at least genetics from some of the brewing strains. So there's probably a hybridization event somewhere around there with a brewing strain and a wild cerevisier. So maybe 400, 500 years.
Okay, 400, 500 years. Very cool. I wasn't aware that there was sort of a date on that, so that's cool.
I guess there's a date on the brewing strains, and it does have some of the genetics of the brewing strains, so that's just based on that.
Gotcha. So yeah, so it is not a wild yeast. It is a brewer's yeast. It has had evolutionary pressure on it, so it's not like going outside and just finding yeast Belgian style, letting whatever flies in the window ferment your beer. It's not like that. It is, for the most part, they are all POF negative, which means they don't make phenols, which are those peppery, clovey type flavors that you'll get in like a Belgian Saison. And they have a couple of unique genetic features, one of which is that it'll dry naturally. And so you can use one of these like Kveik rings to just kind of put it in a fermenting wort, and then you can hang it up, let it dry, and then pull that down next time you brew. Maybe it's 6 months later, and you just swirl it in your hot wort, and it'll start fermenting, which is not something that happens with most brewers' yeasts. And my understanding is, and maybe you know something about this, Lance, but there wasn't so much barley in Norway that they were able to brew constantly. It was more special event stuff. So they just didn't brew so frequently that they were reusing the yeast over and over. So it developed this ability to dry and then be reused later.
Or at least, yeah. I mean, that's certainly a feature of it that made it useful for that. That sounds like a chicken and egg sort of situation.
Sure. Yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, yeah, whether they, I don't know. Again, it's hard to put these things back together through the.
Right. What's that? Right. When if you had a limited amount, you had to make a decision about, are we going to make bread with this or are we going to make beer with this? And I think.
You should always make beer.
By law, they had to make beer.
Right. They had to make beer on occasion by law.
Norway.
In Norway. Yeah. But the most important feature of it is that it can ferment at ridiculously high temperatures without creating all kinds of off flavors. So normal ale yeast ferments around 65 degrees. This stuff, most strains you can do over 90 degrees without getting any kind of crazy esters or higher alcohols that'll have like an acetone-like flavor. If you do that with normal yeast, it'll just be, your beer will be a total mess. That is, it's what makes it really special. And the reason that matters is that if you can ferment very hot, that means the fermentation happens really, really fast. And so for instance, this beer, Hot as Hell, that that Almanac did, that's 8 days old. We did that last Friday. Normally a double IPA, that's 8%. How long does it normally take you guys to get one of those out?
12 to 14 days.
12 to 14?
Even though this is 8 days old, it was actually packaged on day 5. So, so it's 3 days old. So sorry, it's kind of stale now.
So in an era when, hazy IPAs and freshness is sort of like what everyone's chasing, this stuff feels like a bit of a game changer to me. Also, say for a brewery that is coming up on reaching capacity, that needs to expand one way or another, one way they can do that is just by switching their yeast strains, I think, to Kveik strains. Instead of, maybe spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to build or millions of dollars to build a new brewery. I mean, not that hopefully they wouldn't get there eventually also, but if you can even add 20%, I mean, this is something I think Damian might know more about. I feel like this is a game-changing yeast, but I don't really know the numbers, behind brewing. And we were actually talking about this earlier today. We'd love to talk to an expert and try to understand, what are the energy savings you could possibly capture. You don't even have to cool your wort down below, say, 90 degrees before you pitch your yeast. And then you don't have to chill your fermenters a ton. And also you're cranking out beer at maybe even 50% of the speed. So I'm going to pass the mic over here to Damian. And I guess you can just tell us a little bit about what you think of that.
I'm going to steal Lance's mic
okay.
because I feel like I'm going to unplug that.
Yeah, this one is short.
Yeah, this one's way cooler. How's it look? Good? Okay. Thanks for that, Chris. As Chris mentioned, my name's Damian Fagan, co-founder of Almanac Beer Company, located in Chicago. Just kidding. We're in Alameda. Some of you may have heard of us before. But yeah, we're having a ton of fun with Kveik. The easiest way for me to say it is to forget the V altogether. So
I think that's normal. Yeah.
From my perspective, aside from just exploring this sort of novel and new yeast culture, which frankly in this industry, we have lots of opportunities to be creative, but it's rare that something like completely new comes along. And I think this yeast really qualifies as something super exciting and new. So the beer that we contributed for this event is called Hot as Hell, as Chris mentioned, and it's the 5th Kveik beer that we've made. And they've really good. Thank you. We're really happy with how this turned out. And each free beer. We only brewed 4 gallons of it, so that's the problem.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, that's it. That's the last of it right there. No, but each time we've brewed with it, we've sort of explored and tried to push the boundaries with it more and more. So, this is sort of the latest incarnation of it. But, backing up to kind of Chris's, comment around what kind of impact might this make, for a brewery or the industry, being able to turn a double IPA literally in 4 days, so from grain to glass in 4 days versus 12 or 14, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to sort of figure that out. So most breweries, ours included, our biggest bottleneck is fermentation space. So we have a ton of fermenters. I think we have 21 different fermenters, and it's a combination of steel and oak. But if you don't have anywhere to stick the beer, you can't brew any more beer. So just last month, we just opened our new facility in Alameda in February of last year, and it's got about a 20,000 barrel a year capacity. We were now operating as of last month at around 1,600 barrels a month. And so we are already at capacity. And so we've already put millions of dollars into this facility. And to Chris's point, the prospect of, more, brewing equipment's very capital intensive. So 100 barrel fermenter, including installation and glycol, can be $50,000 or $60,000, and those costs can add up very quickly. So one of the things we try and look for is where are the efficiencies we can find in the actual brewing process. When Chris came back from his festival in Norway, we got together over beers, and he was like, would you guys want to get together and try and collaborate on a Kveik beer? And I got our brewmaster, Phil Emerson, who couldn't be here tonight, together, and he was, Phil loves experimenting in our brew team. By the way, shout out to David here, who's one of our brewers and our lab manager. But we love to experiment, and so we did our first Kveik beer, and it was brewed on a Thursday, and it was on tap in our tap room on Monday. And for us, for anybody who homebrews or who's in the brewing industry, that's absolutely mind-boggling. In fact, the beer started to actively ferment before the tank was done being filled. So we had active fermentation within minutes of actually, filling the tank. So that's astonishing. The beer was almost completely finished in 18 hours. It dropped from 17 degrees Plato to 4 in 18 hours. And then it finished out in the next 12 to 14 hours. That is seriously insane. And it was fermenting at 101 degrees, right? Which is also just kind of mind blowing. And as Chris also mentioned, no off flavors as far as we could detect. Really intense flavors, but they weren't what we would characteristically describe as sort of off. So from my perspective as a brewery owner, the potential for this yeast is enormous. We're not at a place yet. So what we've been doing at Almanac is we basically take our existing house recipes for specific beers, and as a control, the only thing we change is the yeast. So that way we can actually know exactly how the beers taste. And David's also in charge of our sensory program. And so he does a very thorough job. We have a lot of the staff involved. And we sort of try and isolate what exactly is the yeast contributing to any specific beer. And so, we're not far along in the process yet to where we can confidently say, you know what, we're going to permanently swap out our house ale culture with a Kveik. But I don't necessarily think that's out of the range of possibility. So it's just going to require more and more experimentation. We may have to tweak things like the grist bill and the hop bill to sort of accommodate some of the flavors that come out of the Kveik. But it's really incredibly exciting because instead of investing, let's say, another $1 million in extra equipment, I could potentially yield 2 to 3 times as much beer as I currently am if I can reduce the fermentation times. Because for us, it's the only bottleneck we have. We don't have bottlenecks in the packaging phase at all. So for us, this could make a really huge impact. So we're super excited from the business side of what this could do.
Very cool. And what did you ferment hot as hell with?
Was it the Voss strain?
It was the Voss strain from Omega.
All of our yeast strains have been from Lance. We've used 2 strains. The first 4 beers were with the Hornindal strain. The Voss is the first beer we've done with Hot as Hell. It's a more, I would say, refined. It's sort of less expressive, which I actually kind of enjoy more. But they're both wonderful and different. But it's It's our first attempt with the Voss.
Yeah, it's a really great beer. Completely clean. Both the Voss and the Hornindal do a great job of making hazy IPAs, creating those kind of tropical and citrus flavors that you want in those kind of beers. So it seems like it works pretty well for most American, like common American craft beer styles.
Right. Between those two strains, I would say the Voss is the one that's going to fit in as more of a conventional type ale profile, where if you didn't tell people how you did it, they wouldn't bat an eye. Yeah, so so backing up some, we found out about these yeasts in 2015 by reading Lars' blog. And if any of you
Lars
folks out
Marius
there,
Garschel.
if you have not read
He's the man.
that
Yeah.
blog, it's
No one would know
fantastic.
about this stuff if not for the efforts made by Lars Marius Garschel traveling around Norway, meeting farmhouse brewers, getting yeast samples.
Yeah, and watching how they do things. And I think he's actually like a computer programmer or something, right?
Yeah, no, he has a real job,
Yeah,
and a
his
family
day
and
job.
everything too. Yeah.
But he's also a amateur historian and has kind of brought these to the attention of the world. These are very literally farmhouse beers or farmhouse strains, in that they are stored and housed in literal farmhouses, not
like
commercial ale strains.
In a way that like your Belgian Saisons kind of really aren't quite.
Yeah, no, I mean, we call DuPont, for example, a farmhouse ale, but that is very much a factory, a beer factory. These were literally farmhouse ale strains. So yeah, we found out about these in 2015 and kind of made it our mission to get a hold of them. And we first tried to reach out to Lars directly, and I think maybe he thought we were crackpots or something because he didn't return our messages. So I'm like, well, he's been submitting these to this yeast bank in the UK, so let's reach out to them. So we kind of read through the descriptions that Lars had on his blog about the flavors these strains were producing, and landed on one we wanted to try. So we got that from the NCYC, this yeast bank in the UK, and that's if you read his nomenclature, this is the Stronda strain. We ended up calling it Hothead Ale when we commercialized it. So when we first got it, we brewed, I don't remember what the recipe was, but it was something fairly simple because we wanted to really get the idea of the yeast character, and split it 3 ways, fermenting 68, kind of your typical 68 Fahrenheit, your typical ale fermentation temperature, 85 and in the 90s. Let them ferment out, carved them up, sampled them, and really could not tell a significant difference between the three, other than that the highest ferment temperature attenuated a little more. So it was a little slightly drier, but flavor-wise, we're similar across the board. And again, I can't stress this enough that if you were to do this with your normal American or English ale strain, they would make a lot of fusel alcohols. They'd make a lot of ethyl acetate, so it would taste hot. I mean, like literally hot. It had kind of have a burn to it, and it would be nail polish, acetone, a lot of unpleasant flavors, but these strains do not create any of those flavors. So we were believers right off the bat. So we put that strain out there for people to try, and we called it Hothead. Again, this was 2015. Since that time, we've had people say, why don't you call this Stronda Kveik? And that's because in 2015, nobody knew what these things were. If we had marketed a strain called Stronda Kveik, we wouldn't have sold any of it. So we gave it a cute little name like Hothead.
Yeah, and I mentioned this earlier when we were talking, and it takes it back to a point that you made a second ago, which is in this like modern moment in American craft beer, where like every brewery is looking for the next trend to jump on. The fact that these yeasts really are just getting some attention is almost unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, we've been flogging these things for 4 years now. I mean, we travel all over the country talking about them, and still, I mean, if people haven't used them, I think there are still skeptics out there. I mean, there's
absolutely
fewer and fewer because you can find these beers more readily now, but we've had to battle skeptics along the way.
Yeah, people don't believe the temperatures. People are always asking, will it contaminate my brewery? Is it diastaticus? It's not. Is it wild? It's not. Will it make phenols? No.
It gives most brewers a panic attack to think about walking into the brewery and seeing that temperature reading at 90 or 100.
Put your hand on the tank and its body temperature, and
Drinking it, it tastes like soup.
Right.
100 is like hot for a hot tub.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people can't handle that.
It's a jacuzzi.
Hot.
Yeah.
It's really hot.
How hot is too hot?
I mean,
like,
we're talking
when you get to
blood.
the upper range.
Yeah.
You're like, what's the upper range of this and like
I think
acceptability?
Nicole said that she's at Alvarado Street, and I think they fermented a beer out at 105.
We knocked out at 92. Like,
Yeah.
just thinking about that made me like, like I felt like somebody
So
threw me to the ice water. I'm like,
Just,
oh God.
just for context, that's 40 degrees hotter than that beer would normally ferment. So 40 degrees is, like 70% warmer than it is kind of surreal. It's mind-boggling. I remember Phil, every like 20 minutes, Phil would Slack me or text me like a new picture of the temperature reading, and I'd be like, dude, I think you're gonna break shit. Like, slow it down, And then the beer was done fermenting in 18 hours. It was fucking mind-boggling.
And we've got Master Cicerone Nicole Erny over here from Alvarado Street, a true badass. They did a beer for this event. Well, not for this event. They did a beer with Kveik. Oh, okay. So they did do it for this event. Very cool. All right.
Literally for this event.
Awesome. And it is also fabulous. You should give that a try. The Alvarado Street.
It's a collab with Imperial Yeast. Sorry.
Yep. A collab with Imperial Yeast. It's called Kveik and Ike. They put some Mike and Ikes in there.
Only 2 boxes.
Yeah, it doesn't taste like Mike and Ike's.
7-barrel batch. I mean, it was just kind of like
Yeah.
so we could use the name.
Yeah.
This is the lemon lime
It's-
coming from the Matuika hops that are in there.
It is a fantastic name.
It's a good beer.
So, okay, back to Lance, I think. Lance, pick it back. Yeah. Well, questions are welcome.
Were they all from the East Bank, or were any of them collected in the field? Or?
So the question is, where did you find these yeasts that you now release for pros and homebrewers to use?
So I would have gotten them all from Lars, but he didn't answer our messages when we first
Lars.
messaged. So Stranda Hothead came from NCYC. Voss did come from Lars. So that culture, I think, historically has had a couple yeast strains in it, and the sample we got had bacteria in it as well, but we purified just a single strain out of that. So that one did come from Lars, from, I don't remember who the farmer is, but somewhere in Voss. Hornindal we actually also got from the NCYC. And that one is comprised of the full yeast blend from that minus bacteria.
And that's interesting. That's something I did not know. Most of the Kveik, I think, that you get in Norway, just based on the fact that they're storing it in these completely, essentially unsanitary ways, they are blends of yeast. And then my impression was that labs like yours would find like the single strain that they thought was doing the best job and then release that as whatever that kind of Kveik is, but you're saying the Hornindal that you sell is actually a blend. That's really cool.
Yeah, and kind of one of the reasons we did that, there's actually been some work done by the folks on the back of your shirt, Escarpment Labs in Canada, and they kind of looked at the characteristics of all these strains, and they had pulled individual strains out of the Hornindal blend, and there are different features as far as their alcohol tolerance and their flocculation, which is how they clump together and fall out. Some of them are very flocculent, some aren't, and different ester profiles between them. So we really didn't want to have to go through the work of figuring out which had what characteristics, so we just kept the blend intact.
Is that a challenge for production for a lab?
The way we'll start our cultures, we won't do, I guess, what you'd want to do as a traditional microbiologist, which is to take a single colony to start it up. So we'll just take a swath off the plate, so we get whatever's there, and more than likely it's going to stay.
And you also surprised me earlier. You said that, I don't remember if it was the Stranda or the Voss, but one of them actually came to you as a single strain.
Stranda, I think if you go back and read Lars' blog, he talks about this one where when they sent that culture to the NCYC to bank, there was literally a single colony that popped up. So it was a single pure one strain. Just that one barely held on.
Yeah,
so that's actually it's one of those kind of mind-blowing things to think about, that anybody who's made a beer with Hothead across this country has used a derivative from that one single strain, or that one single cell that popped up on a plate and grew into a colony at the NCYC.
And essentially rescued this bug that was almost extinct, I guess.
Right. No, I mean, if that one cell didn't survive, there would be no Hothead.
That's pretty wild. Actually, it's a little off topic, but we talked earlier and you mentioned something about the great yeast genocide of, I'll let you
Yeah, I think one of the things in reading Lars' blog and reading about how he's gone around the world looking at these kind of unique farmhouse cultures that are apart from any sort of industrialized brewing. There are the like the Kveik and some strains in Lithuania, maybe some in Russia. These are strains that have been maintained in non-industrial environments and that have some unique features. Where if you look back in the 1800s when Pasteur discovered that yeast was the fermentative organism responsible for making beer and wine and all that, and figured out the techniques at the Carlsberg lab, figured out how to actually isolate the strains and get them clean and away from the bacteria, and use pure culture techniques to make very consistent and good beer. Once this happened, all of the brewing strains that people were using around the world, they'd been passing them from brewery to brewery. They didn't have any means of isolating. They didn't know it. They didn't know what the organisms were. They didn't know techniques to isolate them. So everybody had their unique cultures around. And then along comes Pasteur, and the Carlsberg lab figures out how to purify yeast. And now these pure strains are getting passed around to breweries, and everybody's brewing with pure yeast cultures, and probably just jettisoned whatever they were using before. And at that point, there was what I'd call a yeast genocide. So all these unique cultures that were out there were just lost and lost forever, which makes me more appreciative that there are things like the Kveik, where we've had these farmhouse brewers maintain these things for hundreds of years, for generations. And they have very special, unique features to them because they were kind of isolated away from the industrialized brewing strains, which all kind of evolved from each other and are very similar. So I think we lost a lot of genetic diversity when we figured out how to purify yeast strains. So it makes it even more special that there were things like this that were maintained.
Yeah, and it highlights again how important, how awesome it is that Lars has been traveling around getting this stuff, because, if no one had kind of noticed for another generation, how many more of these would have been lost? Because I will say, just based on my experience being there and going to the North Cornell Festival, most of the guys who are doing it are like older, and maybe their kids won't be interested, right? And so,
asshole Gen Y, what generation are we on now?
Who cares?
So we would have just lost these things.
I mean, home brewing, like, why bother? You can just buy good beer, right? A lot of these strains in Norway, my understanding is, have been lost because dry bread yeast became available at the corner store, or whatever the equivalent of the corner store is in places like Hornindal. So why bother?
Hornindal store.
Yeah, why bother with all this? And taking the chance that the beer you make will not turn out great because maybe there's some bacteria in it or whatever. Why take that chance? Let's take some questions. Anybody? Nicole.
So one thing I noticed about working with Kveik,
It's all correct.
I'm going to reference my favorite Norwegian. Is that the range is just so huge compared to other brewers' yeast. So you just talk a little bit about that, like how can this organism exist and perform well in such a wide range versus other brewers' yeast, and what are some of the differences you've seen as you've developed commercial yeast, because you probably had a lot of different choices to make about which one you want to bring to market. So if you just talk about
So the escarpment in Canada has done some of the actual genetics behind it. And I think we're still at a pretty early stage as far as figuring out what makes these things different. Because again, even an American or an English ale strain would love to ferment and grow at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. They just don't make good beer because they're making the fusels and the esters. So there's fairly clearly something different about the genetic pathways for making fusels and making esters in these strains. So I think with time we'll figure out what those differences are, and I think that's one of the things we're interested in, is figuring out what makes them unique and can we apply those changes to other brewing strains. And yeah, I mean, we have the power to do these things. So I think it's a matter of figuring out the differences. And when they did those genetic studies on those, they found lots of SNPs for the geneticists out there. So single nucleotide polymorphisms, single genetic changes that are different between typical brewing yeasts and these strains. So it's a matter of time to try to figure out which of these SNPs are important and give the Kveik these properties and how we can apply those to other yeasts.
So the question is, can you tell us a little bit about the different strains and the differences in how they taste and such?
So of the three that we make available, the Hothead, the first one, I think is the most neutral of the three. So I was actually in Tennessee somewhat recently, and somebody had made an English mild with it. And again, kind of highlighting the power of this thing. He could have served it in 2 or 3 days. I mean, it was done fermenting in 18 hours, and it was like a 2.8% alcohol beer. But again, if he hadn't told you anything about this, it tastes like normal English mild. And so it's fairly neutral. Voss gives a little bit of citrus character to it. A little orange rind. Hornindal, we get maybe a little bit of pineapple. You've used it maybe to see how you describe it, but we always get a little pineapple. Some people in the lab have described like an umami flavor. I don't know, just there's something a little different about that. Hornindal is definitely the one that's the most intense of the three.
The Oslo hot chicken beer that we did at Almanac, which was
It was the chicken that gave that the
double
umami.
IPA. Yeah. Henhouse was in on that one, hence the name. Was just super tropical, but I mean, it was impossible to pull apart the fancy hops that were used with the yeast character.
All I'll add is we've used the 2 strains, Voss, which was the beer we have on tonight, and then the previous 4 were all the Hornindal strain. I think I was saying earlier, Voss is a little more restrained. I think citrusy and floral. It's kind of what I get in our initial experiments with like Oslo hot chicken, and we do a DIPA called Loud. We called it Viking Loud, and we allowed those temps to get up to 100 or more. We got really like lots of caramelized orange peel and overripe fruit, almost like and I mean this in a good way, almost like rotting bananas and rotting pineapple. But like in the best way, like candied pineapple, candied banana.
I think of the oranginess as almost like Grand Marnier.
Yeah, I think Grand Marnier is a great way to sort of describe it. So it was really interesting. Voss is very different, although we purposely fermented this beer at around 90 degrees just to kind of see what it would do.
Well, that's a good question. Do you think you get a lot more esters if you do it a little hotter, or you said you couldn't tell much of a difference?
We haven't been. I think somebody needs to do that with a like a GC gas chromatograph to really. I'm not convinced. I don't know. Somebody with maybe a better Cicerone, for example, should maybe try those. We haven't detected much difference.
Equipment is definitely on my wish list.
Our GCs are very strong, and somebody needs to do this. The claims people make, if you read like Lars' blog and read, we get these questions on a daily basis, like you have to underpitch to get these really, really intense flavors, and it's critical to the flavor. We've done some of these experiments and don't see a big difference. I think these are just claims people have made.
To like do it once and have a certain result, and then
we call those anecdotes, and the plural of anecdotes is not data.
Right.
The few things we've done haven't shown a significant difference in pitch rate and character and temperature and all these things. So I think I'm still not convinced by these things. And I mean, if they're not making huge ester profiles at 95. I think that's pointing towards some of these genes involved in making the esters being flat out broken. So they're not,
They'll never make them.
Yeah, they're not going to make them whether you're at 70 or 95. If they did, these would be undrinkable.
So what happens if you are fermenting at like 65 or 70? I mean, like,
they're normal ale yeast then.
It's going to go on the normal process and hang out for an extra
Normal
couple days.
timeline.
Yeah, what's the timeline like?
I mean, they're like typical ale strains when you treat them like typical ale strains.
How's the repeatability of harvesting this yeast?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people are still feeling this out as well. And we have some folks have told us that they do get a fairly big drop in viability with the really high fermentation temperatures, but it also doesn't seem to matter that much because they recover so quickly. So they've pitched 50% viable yeast, which you'd probably never do on a normal circumstance.
You dump that.
Right. But they'll do that, and the survivors rapidly, it takes one generation for that to recover, and that they seem to recover quickly. Again, I mean, people have been storing them on these things for centuries.
Get it up to like 10, 12 generations. Like,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
We have a sweet lab, by the way. I'm just going to say. David runs our lab. It's very sweet.
But yeah, that's just my one concern with it. It's like the great thing about yeast is you can reuse it all the time.
Yeah.
English ale, but this one sounded like we can't.
And we're using it very differently than the Norwegians have, so I think there's something different about dipping that in there while it's actively fermenting. You're pulling it out and it's drying, so it's never been exposed to the high alcohol levels it sees when it's done.
Right.
So I think there is something very different about kind of pulling it out of those conditions and storing it versus the way we use it, which is to wait for it to finish, drop, and harvest from there. So we are using it in a different way. So I think we're still figuring out that aspect of it.
So maybe we'll just take like one more question or so, and then we'll go drink some akavit.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm tired of this beer.
If this ferments so much faster, are giant industrial brewers looking into using it?
On the one hand, the big breweries are very slow to make changes. They just don't pivot quickly. They're kind of like, huge bureaucracies, whereas the small guys can just, start experimenting immediately. But I think our general consensus was that potentially they could capture massive efficiencies. And I was saying, if you play the effects of Kveik out all the way to the end, what happens? Do you have like Goose Island flooding the market with insanely cheap beer because they can crank it out at an absurdly fast rate?
I kind of will piggyback on what Chris says. I actually will be surprised if we don't see some of the larger breweries figuring out. My guess would be right now there's probably a lot of that R&D happening kind of behind closed doors, if you will. Because even somebody on my scale, we'll brew 20,000 barrels this year, which Anheuser-Busch has brewed since this talk started, would be monumental for them. And even for a small brewery like us, it could have huge impacts. The only other thing I want to add to that is, despite the fact that I think the speed at which works is getting a lot of the attention, and appropriately, it's shocking. But independent of that, the new flavor profiles are actually worthy of note in and of themselves. I mean, I actually believe that, even if these beers weren't substantially faster in terms of their production, they'd still be super interesting and cool, and there would be a really viable place for them in beer. It obviously is accelerated by the fact that the beer, is made so much more quickly. But the beers are really interesting, and it's not just because, I made this beer in 48 hours.
So to add to that, I think the flavor profiles are probably different enough that they're not going to necessarily be able to directly replace, like Goose Island's not going to be able to start making 312 with Voss. It's going to taste too different.
Kveik can never completely take over the industry, right? I mean, you can't make certain beer styles with this stuff, so it's not gonna bulldoze every other yeast strain.
Until we take its genes and put it into our favorite strain.
So that was actually one other point I wanted to make. So we've brewed with it 5 times, and we've made 3 completely different styles of beer. So we've done 3 DIPAs. We've done a winter warmer, basically an amber ale that was aged on figs. And then most recently, aside from Hot as Hell, we did a sour beer. So we did a mixed culture Kveik blend. The cool thing for us is it's not just about, okay, how do we make a cool DIPA? It's like, holy crap, we might be able to use this for a huge range of styles. So that's super exciting for us.
Right, and the English mild I had in Tennessee, I really feel like the English mild needs to be out there because it's one of those ones you can drink all day, and it's probably, I think it's at that ABV level where it's essentially hydrating you, and you're not getting drunk. So imagine being able to churn out, package a batch of that every 48 hours. I mean, I think you could literally do that with these strains, and it's going to taste like an English mild and hydrate you.
I have a ESB that I did with Freewheel in there. That's very good. That was with Voss from Omega.
And it probably tastes like an ESB, right?
It does. It's great. I think if you didn't tell someone it used Voss, they would not necessarily know.
Yeah, I mean, English strains are expressive.
Yeah. It's got it's got enough fruitiness that it seems just completely appropriate, but it's not over the top. So I think. All right, Tom.
So 5 years from now, you're talking about yeast. What are you talking about?
5 years from now, we're talking about yeast. We're talking about genetic engineering. I think so. Yeah, I don't know if we need to go into any more detail, right?
I completely agree with that. You know, we're even experimenting right now with genetically modified yeast in these very small controlled 10-barrel batches, and it's wild what is sort of happening. We're using yeasts that actually generate the same hop aromas as hops, but through fermentation, which is really wild.
With genes from basil and mint.
Yes, they're splicing together genes from different sources. And this is true story. Phil, our brewmaster, told me that somebody's recently figured out how to trick a yeast cell into producing psilocybin during fermentation.
There's another one that can do THC. Yeah.
So
Cannabinoids.
I think, you know, genetically modified yeast is going to be an increasingly interesting thing. I mean, I took real mushrooms about an hour ago, and I'll say they're still better than. I'm just kidding.
Oakland just decriminalized them. Yeah, decriminalized them. Yeah.
I gotta go.
Yeah, I gotta go to Oakland. See ya. See y'all in Oakland.
Are any of these Norwegian farmers getting any compensation from the yeast they're brought to the world?
Yeah. I'll let Lance take this.
Yeah, so not the Norwegian brewers, just based on how we ended up getting these. Kind of related, we ended up we have a partnership with a Lithuanian farmhouse brewer from whom we got a strain that she's been using in their family for over 100 years, and we have a relationship with her where we pay her royalties on that strain, but in exchange we can use her kind of branding, the name of her brewery and all that. But no, with those, I mean, we got a couple of them through the yeast, you know, the strain bank in the UK, and Lars sent us the other. So that's just not how that ended up happening.
Culture appropriation.
Yeah. So I come from before I did this, I was a patent attorney. So I have almost a very, almost a legalistic way to view this, and that, so you can patent organisms that you manipulate, that we genetically manipulate, or we mate strains, we can patent those things and we have property rights over those things. But a naturally occurring organism is owned by humanity. I mean, there's, you know, I mean, I guess the way I would look at it, and I'm not trying to be an asshole, but these farmers didn't invent the strains either. They got, I mean, they passed these things around to each other, and they didn't create these strains.
So if he buys yeast from you, can he share it with somebody else?
Sure. Nothing I can do about it.
It does happen. It happens, yeah.
Oh yeah, no, this is definitely, I mean, that is common in the brewing world, is breweries passing strains around, including strains that we've hybridized strains that we've filed patent applications on. Brewers pass these to each other. We're not going to sue our customers or sue people. We could, sure, but we're not going to. That's just how we legally could, but we don't. That's just not how the brewing industry works.
Yeah, there's practices that have been going on in the industry forever.
Yeah, it's kind of like your Netflix account, right? You could just give someone else your password and your username, and it's like, they're kind of like, well, you know, as long as people are watching, it's cool, you know.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, that's.
And you know, Chris is a naturally occurring organism, right? And humanity definitely owns Chris. So.
I wouldn't be here but for CRISPR.
Two lawyers.
Oh yeah, you guys are. You're both lawyers.
Yeah. Lance and I are both
fucking former lawyers.
Yeah,
you're recovering lawyers.
Recovering attorneys who both did IP stuff.
Yeah.
I think intellectual property attorneys, in my experience, have a dimmer view of intellectual property than the average person.
Dimmer
in the sense that we are so aware of how it can be used as a weapon. Yeah. So anyway, thank you all for coming. Thank you to Damian and Lance. And all right, next round's on Damian. Thanks, y'all.